It had been one of those long, lazy summer days when the air seemed to stand still, heavy with heat and the smell of sunscreen. My wife, Jessica, had invited a few friends over for an afternoon by the pool. Among them was Sarah, her best friend, someone I had known for years. Sarah was the kind of woman who drew attention effortlessly, confident, with an easy grace and laughter that always felt contagious. She was also happily married, or so I thought, and we had never shared more than polite conversation and friendly banter. As the sun began to set, casting golden hues across the water, Jessica received an urgent phone call from work. With a sigh, she excused herself, apologizing as she rushed off to handle whatever crisis demanded her attention. It wasn't unusual for her to be called away like this, but that left just Sarah and me, sitting on opposite ends of the patio, the quiet between us growing as the distant hum of the city filtered in. "You staying for a swim?" I asked, trying to break the silence. Sarah glanced at me, her lips curving into a soft smile, but there was something unreadable in her expression. "Maybe," she replied. "But only if you join me." There was a brief pause before I answered, caught off guard by her invitation. Yeah, I could do that." My heart rate picked up slightly, though I wasn't entirely sure why. It was just Sarah, Jessica's best friend. There was nothing unusual about a swim on a hot evening. I stood up and headed inside to change into my swim trunks, telling myself this was just a friendly gesture, nothing more. But as I came back out and saw Sarah slipping into the water, something shifted. Her movements were slow, deliberate, as she waded into the pool, her hair catching the last rays of sunlight. I shook my head, trying to dispel the sudden tension I felt in the pit of my stomach. She was my wife's best friend. Whatever was going on in my mind needed to stop. I dove into the pool, the cool water enveloping me, momentarily washing away the strange atmosphere. When I resurfaced, Sarah was closer than I expected, her smile warm but with an edge that made my breath hitch. "You know," she started, her voice low, "it's funny how things change, isn't it?" I frowned, unsure of where she was going with this. "What do you mean?" "People. Relationships. What we thought we knew about each other," she said, her fingers trailing through the water, causing ripples that seemed to reach me even from a few feet away. "Sometimes things shift, and you start to notice someone in a way you didn't before." I felt a tightening in my chest. Was she talking about Jessica? About her marriage? Or was there something else in her words that I wasn't fully understanding? "Yeah," I said slowly, trying to keep my tone neutral, even though the air between us was anything but. "I guess that happens sometimes." Sarah moved a little closer, and my heart beat faster as she studied me, her gaze lingering on my face, on my lips. "You ever feel like that? Like someone who's been in your life for a long time suddenly becomes different?" Her question hung in the air between us, thick and heavy, and I struggled to find an answer that wouldn't betray the confusing rush of emotions rising inside me. "Sometimes," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper, unsure where this was headed, but unable to deny the strange pull between us. The truth was, I had never thought of Sarah that way. But something had changed in the air around us tonight, and I was powerless to stop it. Sarah's eyes locked with mine, and for a moment, it felt like everything around us disappeared. The setting sun, the fading sounds of the city, even the lingering sense of guilt that gnawed at me. All that existed in that instant was her and me, the tension between us growing more palpable with every second. She drifted closer, the water gently lapping at our bodies as her hand grazed my arm, a touch so subtle, yet charged with an intensity that sent shivers through me. My breath caught, and I couldn't help but glance down at her hand, my mind reeling. This was wrong. I knew it, but there was something about the way she looked at me, as if she had been holding back something for far too long, and now it was spilling over, impossible to contain. "I've been thinking," Sarah said softly, her voice barely audible above the sound of the water, "about what it means to want something you can't have." My pulse quickened, my mind searching for the right words, but all I could feel was the weight of her confession sinking into my skin. Was this really happening? My wife's best friend was standing inches away from me, her gaze burning into mine, and everything about this moment felt forbidden, wrong, but irresistibly magnetic. I shouldn't be saying this, she added, almost to herself, shaking her head as if trying to push the thoughts away. But I can't help it. There's something between us, isn't there? Something we've both been ignoring for too long. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. I didn't know what to say. How could I? Until this moment, I had never considered the possibility of there being something more between us. Sarah had always been Jessica's friend, nothing more. But now, standing here, feeling her touch, seeing the vulnerability in her eyes, I couldn't deny that there was something shifting inside me, something dangerous and thrilling. "Sarah," I finally managed, my voice thick with hesitation, but before I could finish, she moved even closer, her body brushing against mine in the water. Her hand slipped down my arm, her fingers trailing lightly, sending waves of electricity through me. "I know we shouldn't," she whispered, her lips so close I could feel her breath on my skin. "But I don't want to pretend anymore." A part of me screamed to stop, to pull away, to remind myself that this was wrong, that Jessica, my wife, was just inside, completely oblivious to what was happening. But another part of me, a part one barely recognized, was drawn to Sarah, to the way she made me feel in this moment, alive, desired, wanted in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. Her fingers found mine under the water, and she laced them together, her grip firm, yet gentle. "Tell me you don't feel it too," she challenged, her eyes searching mine for something, anything, that would tell her she wasn't alone in this. I swallowed hard, my chest tight with the weight of the decision before me. I should have said something, anything to stop this from going further. But instead, I found myself inching closer to her, my heart racing as the distance between us disappeared entirely. I do, I finally admitted, the words falling from my lips before I could stop them. It was the truth, even though I knew it was a truth that could tear everything apart. "But what are we doing? This is—" "Don't think about it," Sarah cut me off, her voice firm yet filled with the same uncertainty I felt. "Just let it happen." Her hand slid up my chest, her touch sending shockwaves through me, and before I knew it, her lips were on mine, soft and tentative at first, testing the boundaries of what we were about to cross. The kiss was electric, filled with a heat and intensity that made my mind spin, and for a brief moment, I gave in to the desire that had been building between us all night. But then, reality crashed down around me, and I pulled away, my heart pounding in my chest. "Sarah, we can't. This isn't right." Her eyes were wide, filled with the same mix of desire and guilt that I felt. "I know," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But that doesn't change how I feel." I ran a hand through my wet hair, trying to make sense of the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside me. "What about Jessica? What about your husband?" Sarah's expression faltered, and for the first time, I saw the cracks in her confidence. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "I don't know what this means for any of us." We stood there in the water, the weight of our actions hanging heavy in the air between us. There was no going back from this, no erasing what had just happened. We had crossed a line, and now we were left to face the consequences, whatever they might be. The air around us felt heavy with the weight of what had just happened. My mind raced, struggling to catch up with the reality that I had crossed a boundary I swore I'd never breach. Sarah's presence next to me, her breath still slightly ragged from the kiss, reminded me that what had been just an unspoken tension was now something much more dangerous, something real. "I shouldn't have done that," I muttered, though even as I said it, I knew that I couldn't fully regret it. There had been something between us tonight, a connection that I didn't know how to explain, but it had felt undeniable. Sarah sighed, her fingers still intertwined with mine, though neither of us moved. "I'm not blaming you," she said quietly. "We're both responsible for this. But, God, I don't know what to do now." For a moment, the only sound was the gentle ripple of water as we stood there, suspended between guilt and something neither of us could name. I could feel her eyes on me, waiting for an answer I didn't have. What were we supposed to do? Pretend like nothing had happened? Act like this was just a fleeting moment of madness that we could brush off once we left the pool? We can't just go back to normal, I said, finally breaking the silence, my voice thick with the weight of the words. What we just did, it changes things, doesn't it? Sarah nodded slowly, her lips pressed into a thin line. It does. And I don't know how to deal with that. The vulnerability in her voice cut through me. Sarah had always been confident, the kind of woman who seemed to have everything together, but now there was a rawness in her that I'd never seen before. It made her seem more human, more fragile, and it only intensified the pull I felt toward her. I don't want to hurt anyone, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Jessica, she trusts us. She trusts me. And I don't want to betray that. Sarah's gaze dropped, and she bit her lip, as though trying to hold back the flood of emotions she was clearly feeling. I know. I don't want to hurt her either. But I also can't ignore what just happened. This wasn't just a mistake, was it? I didn't know how to answer that. It was a mistake, wasn't it? A lapse in judgment brought on by the charged atmosphere of the evening, by the closeness we'd shared, by the tension that had simmered just beneath the surface for who knew how long. But at the same time, I couldn't deny that there had been something real in that moment, something that felt like it had been building for longer than either of us wanted to admit. I don't know, I finally said, running a hand over my face, trying to clear my thoughts. I don't know what this is or what it means. Sarah took a step closer, her body now fully pressed against mine, and the intensity of her proximity sent another jolt through me. But do you want to find out? She asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Her hand slid up my chest, her touch igniting a fire I was desperately trying to contain. For a moment I considered it. The idea of exploring whatever this was, of seeing where it could lead, was tempting in a way I couldn't deny. But the image of Jessica, the woman I'd promised to love and be faithful to, flashed in my mind, and guilt surged through me, overpowering the desire that threatened to consume me. We can't, I said firmly, stepping back from Sarah, my voice more resolute now, though my heart still raced. We can't do this. It's not fair, to her, to your husband. We've already crossed a line. We can't go any further. Sarah stared at me for a long moment, her eyes searching mine as though trying to find a crack in my resolve. But then, slowly, she nodded, her expression softening into something like acceptance, though there was still a lingering sadness in her eyes. You're right, she said quietly. I know you're right, but that doesn't make it any easier, does it? I shook my head, the tension in my chest tightening. No, it doesn't. For a moment, we just stood there in silence, the weight of our decision hanging heavy between us. Then, without another word, Sarah turned and started to climb out of the pool. I watched her as she wrapped a towel around herself, the spell between us finally breaking, though the remnants of it lingered in the air. I'm going to go, she said softly, her back still turned to me. I think it's best if we don't see each other for a while. At least until we figure this out. I nodded, though she couldn't see me, and my heart ached at the thought of what we had just lost, or maybe what we had just narrowly avoided. As I watched her leave, the sound of her footsteps fading into the distance, I sank into the water, letting the coolness wash over me, trying to drown the confusion, the desire, and the guilt that now swirled inside me. I had no idea how I was going to face Jessica. I had no idea how I was going to pretend like nothing had changed. Because everything had changed. The next few days were a blur of conflicting emotions and restless nights. Jessica, thankfully, didn't seem to notice the tension that had taken root in me. If anything, she was more concerned about work and the upcoming trip we had planned, a weekend getaway to celebrate our anniversary. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had just shared a kiss with her best friend, and now we were about to commemorate our love. The guilt gnawed at me, but every time I thought about telling Jessica, the words got stuck in my throat. Sarah hadn't reached out since that night. Part of me was relieved, but another part, the part one didn't want to admit to, felt a strange sense of loss. I couldn't stop thinking about her. The way her skin had felt against mine, the intensity in her eyes, the way her touch had ignited something deep inside me. But I knew this couldn't go on. We had made the right choice to stop, to step away before we went any further. Or, at least, That's what I kept telling myself. It wasn't until the afternoon of our anniversary trip that I saw her again. Jessica had arranged for a small gathering at our place before we left, a few close friends, including Sarah and her husband, Matt. When Sarah walked in, my heart skipped a beat. She looked just as stunning as she always did, but now there was a weight behind her smile, a heaviness in her eyes that matched my own. I tried to avoid her, staying by Jessica's side and making small talk with the other guests, but every now and then, I'd catch Sarah's gaze from across the room. Each glance sent a ripple of tension through me, a silent reminder of what had almost happened. At one point, I excused myself to the kitchen to grab more drinks. As I opened the fridge, I heard footsteps behind me. My body tensed before I even turned around. I knew who it was. "Hey." Sarah's voice was soft, almost hesitant. I straightened, not daring to look at her.
"Hey."
There was a long pause before she spoke again. "I've been thinking about what happened." I swallowed hard, closing the fridge and gripping the countertop. "We shouldn't talk about it here," I muttered, glancing toward the living room to make sure no one was listening. "I know," she said, stepping closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I need to say this just once. I can't stop thinking about you." I thought it would go away, but it hasn't. My heart pounded in my chest, her words stirring up everything I had been trying to bury. "Sarah, we can't. This is dangerous." She sighed, and I felt her hand brush against my arm. It was a subtle touch, but it sent a shockwave through me. "I know. And I don't expect anything. I just needed you to know." I turned to face her, the weight of her confession hanging in the air between us. Her eyes were filled with emotion, conflict, desire, guilt. It mirrored everything I was feeling. But we both knew there was no easy way out of this. Before I could respond, the sound of laughter from the living room jolted us both back to reality. We stepped apart quickly, like children caught doing something they weren't supposed to. Sarah cleared her throat, offering a strained smile before she walked away, leaving me standing in the kitchen, my heart racing. The rest of the evening passed in a haze. I couldn't focus on the conversation around me. All I could think about was Sarah, her touch, her words, the undeniable connection that still simmered between us despite everything. By the time the guests left and Jessica and I were alone, I felt like I was about to explode from the tension that had built up inside me. "Are you okay?" Jessica asked as she wrapped her arms around me from behind, resting her head on my shoulder. "You've been quiet tonight." I forced a smile, turning to kiss her forehead. "Just tired, I guess." "A lot on my mind." She smiled back, oblivious to the turmoil inside me, and I felt a pang of guilt so sharp it made my stomach twist. "Well, tomorrow we'll be away from all of this," she said cheerfully. "Just you and me. It'll be nice, right?" "Yeah," I murmured, though the thought of escaping with her only intensified the weight on my chest. I loved Jessica, of that I was sure. But whatever had happened with Sarah had complicated everything, and I didn't know how to untangle it. The next morning, we left for the trip. The drive to the lakeside cabin was quiet but pleasant enough. Jessica chatted about work, her friends, and our plans for the weekend, while I tried to focus on her words instead of my own spiraling thoughts. When we finally arrived at the cabin, it was beautiful, nestled deep in the woods, with a stunning view of the lake. Jessica had planned everything perfectly. But as the hours passed and we settled into our weekend together, I found it harder and harder to shake the lingering thoughts of Sarah. It wasn't until that evening, as we sat by the fire pit, that Jessica finally noticed something was off. "You seem distant," she said, her brows knitting together with concern. "Is everything okay?" I hesitated, unsure how to respond. Part of me wanted to tell her everything, to confess what had happened with Sarah, to let it all out and face the consequences. But another part of me, the part that feared losing her, kept me silent. "I'm just tired," I lied, my voice strained. "I think I've been stressed about work and everything." "It's not you." Jessica studied me for a moment, her gaze searching, but then she smiled softly and leaned against me, resting her head on my shoulder. "Well, whatever it is, we'll get through it. We always do." Her words were meant to comfort me, but they only made the knot in my stomach tighten. Because I wasn't sure we would get through this. Not if she knew the truth. As we sat there in the quiet of the night, with the crackle of the fire and the distant sound of the lake lapping at the shore, I realized that no matter what happened with Sarah, things between Jessica and me would never be the same. I had crossed a line, even if only in my mind, and there was no going back. The following day passed in a blur of forced smiles and stifled emotions. Jessica was radiant, full of enthusiasm for our anniversary plans, but all I could do was go through the motions, my mind elsewhere. Every glance, every laugh felt like another blow to the guilt festering inside me. The weight of what I hadn't said to her gnawed at me, but I pushed it down, knowing that telling her would destroy everything. In the late afternoon, we decided to take a walk by the lake. The weather was perfect, warm, with a gentle breeze that rustled the leaves overhead. Jessica held my hand as we strolled along the water's edge, her fingers laced through mine, the picture of a couple in love. And yet, all I could feel was the divide growing between us, even as our hands remained linked. We reached a small dock that jutted out into the lake, and Jessica turned to me, her eyes soft and full of affection. "This place is beautiful, isn't it?" she said, her voice filled with a quiet joy. "I'm so glad we're here together." I nodded, but I couldn't meet her gaze. "Yeah, it is." She tilted her head, studying me for a moment, then stepped closer, wrapping her arms around my waist. "I love you, you know that, right?" The words hit me like a punch to the gut, and I felt my chest tighten. I did love her, but I also couldn't ignore what had happened with Sarah and the fact that it had shaken me to my core. "I love you too," I whispered, though the words felt heavy with the truth I was hiding. Jessica pulled back slightly, her brows furrowing in concern. "Then what's going on, really? You've been distant ever since last night. Did something happen?" I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could find the words, my phone buzzed in my pocket. The sound was jarring, cutting through the intimate moment like a knife. I pulled it out, glancing at the screen, and my heart dropped. It was Sarah. For a split second, I froze. Jessica's eyes flickered to the phone, and though I quickly put it away, I could feel her curiosity sharpen. "Who is that?" she asked, her voice still gentle but laced with suspicion. I hesitated, knowing that whatever I said next could change everything. "Just work stuff," I lied, stuffing the phone back into my pocket. "I'll deal with it later." But Jessica's expression didn't ease. She stepped back, her arms falling to her sides, and I could see the doubt creeping into her eyes. "Work? On a Saturday? Really?" I forced a smile, but it felt weak. "Yeah, it's nothing really." Her gaze lingered on me for a moment longer, then she sighed, turning toward the water. "Okay, if you say so." The rest of the walk back to the cabin was quiet, the tension between us palpable. I could feel Jessica's unease growing, but I didn't know how to fix it. The guilt weighed on me heavier than ever, and with every step, I knew I was sinking deeper into a mess I didn't know how to untangle. When we got back to the cabin, I excused myself to take a shower, hoping the time alone would help me clear my head. But as I stood under the spray of water, my thoughts spiraled out of control. Sarah's message, the kiss, the way things had unraveled so quickly, it was all crashing down on me at once. I stepped out of the shower, drying off quickly, and as I reached for my phone to check Sarah's message, I hesitated. Did I really want to see what she had to say? Did I really want to open that door again, knowing where it could lead? But before I could make a decision, there was a soft knock at the bathroom door. "Hey," Jessica's voice came through, tentative. "Can we talk?" My heart pounded as I opened the door to find her standing there, her expression a mix of concern and frustration. "What's going on with you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You've been acting so strange, and I feel like you're hiding something from me." I swallowed hard, my mind racing. I wanted to tell her the truth, to confess everything, and let the chips fall where they may. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. Not here. Not like this. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice hoarse. I've been stressed." "It's not about you, I promise." She studied me for a long moment, her eyes searching mine for the truth. Then, slowly, she nodded, though I could see the doubt still lingering. "Okay," she said quietly. "But if something's wrong, please just tell me. I don't want any secrets between us." "I know," I whispered, guilt flooding me. "I'm sorry." Jessica gave me a small smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Let's just try to enjoy the rest of the weekend, okay?" I nodded, but inside, I knew that the cracks in our relationship had already started to form. That night, as we lay in bed, Jessica fell asleep quickly, her breathing soft and steady. But I stayed awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind spinning with everything that had happened. I knew I had to make a choice. Either let Sarah go and commit fully to my marriage, or continue down a path that could destroy everything I had built with Jessica. My phone buzzed on the nightstand again. I picked it up, my heart racing as I saw another message from Sarah. My thumb hovered over the screen, but I didn't open it. Instead, I turned off the phone and set it back down, my decision made, though I wasn't sure if it was the right one. In the end, the line we had crossed could never be erased, and the weight of that would follow me for a long time. Jessica would never know the full truth, but I would have to live with it, the guilt of what had almost happened forever lingering in the shadows of my marriage. And as I closed my eyes, trying to force myself to sleep, I realized that some choices, once made, could never truly be undone.